in a small fortified city underground at a depth of more than 1,000 meters. For continuous weeks in the main operations room, Chinese President Xi Jinping sat with senior leaders of the People's Liberation Army, the largest army in the world, to oversee the execution of a long awaited military operation anticipated by most countries in the world, the invasion of Taiwan. After 3 weeks of intense exchanges between American and Chinese forces, and after severe losses for the American Army, including the loss of 2 aircraft carriers and more than 200 advanced fighter jets and thousands of soldiers and officers, the American leadership, in a state of shock, decided to launch nuclear strikes with limited tactical warheads on Chinese military and political targets in Taiwan and in some Chinese cities. Of course, China did not remain silent and responded with a nuclear attack on some of the most important American military assets in the Pacific Ocean, and more importantly, on some cities and states on the West Coast. These attacks resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese and American civilians. After several more weeks of fighting, the American leadership decided to enter into ceasefire negotiations and withdrew its forces in exchange for China retaining Taiwan. What I just told you is not a fictional story, but a scenario in a war game organized by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is one of the most important American research centers. They conduct war games regularly and publish the details and results in a lengthy report at the end of last year, December 2024. The teams representing China and America played the game in the 2024 version 15 times. So why the repetition? Because each time there are new decisions, and the teams representing China and America learn from the previous times. Out of these 15 times, China initially struck American forces with nuclear weapons 7 times. In all these instances, both teams were very focused on answering 2 fundamental questions. What factors could create the greatest pressure, leading America and China to use nuclear weapons during the Taiwan War? And what will happen if nuclear weapons are used? I don't want to talk much about the details of the game, which has some scenarios with notes due to the natural bias present in any entity. What I really want to talk about is the nuclear weapons used by the team representing China to strike America. Look, folks, in short, China currently has the fastest growing and one of the most advanced nuclear arsenals in the world. This arsenal has increased significantly, reaching currently 600 nuclear warheads. According to the latest reports from the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon expects it to reach 1,500 warheads within 10 years from now, by 2035. In addition, China is developing weapons of all types and sizes to carry these warheads, apart from the storage facilities, test sites, and others. Today we are here to understand the details of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, how China built it, when, how much it spent on it, and why it is developing it at such a rapid pace, threatening American and Russian nuclear superiority. Why is America particularly terrified of this path? In today's episode, we will try to understand together and chat about the answers to these questions. What you saw was on the morning of September 3rd in Tiananmen Square, the largest square in the world, when Chinese President Xi Jinping showcased the massive power of the People's Liberation Army with a military parade considered the largest in modern Chinese history. During the parade, we saw a set of missiles that confirmed Beijing's ability to launch nuclear weapons from land, sea, and air, meaning the nuclear triad. This was the first time China publicly and officially confirmed possessing this triad. We are talking about a military capability that only exists in 4 countries in the entire world, which are China, Russia, India, and America. We discussed it in more detail in the episode about the Sentinel program, which we did on the American nuclear arsenal. And it's very important for you to watch it, by the way, because it is considered the first part of this episode. In the Chinese display that captured the world's attention, we saw various types of launch systems capable of carrying nuclear warheads, such as the DF-41 and DF-61 long-range ballistic missiles, the DF-21, DF-26, and DF-27 hypersonic missiles, and the JL-2 and JL-3 submarine missiles, among others. But what might surprise you is that despite this development, the Chinese nuclear arsenal was one of the weakest and smallest nuclear arsenals in the world, and there was no comparison between it and the arsenals of a country like France, for example. I won't even mention Russia and America. How is that possible? I'll tell you. In the 50s, during the escalation of the Cold War, when the Americans and Soviets were fiercely competing to develop the largest and most powerful nuclear bombs on the planet, the Chinese were not interested at all in the nuclear arsenal. Dr. René Pappas, the American expert specializing in the study of Chinese political and military systems, stated in his doctoral thesis, which addressed the development of Beijing's nuclear arsenal, that the Chinese strategic culture during the era of Mao Zedong, which René called the People's War, focused on preparing for conventional war at the expense of neglecting nuclear war. The lack of interest reached the point where Mao called the nuclear bomb by the name that became famous through his words, a paper tiger. This culture made most of the Chinese efforts directed towards nuclear weapons become research and technological development efforts, but there was no intention or steps to produce nuclear weapons extensively and compete with the Americans and Soviets. That was the level of the Chinese regime's interest in nuclear weapons. In the year 1964, China officially joined the nuclear club through its first nuclear explosion in the Lop Nur Desert, after Mao ordered the construction of the bomb, which the Chinese called Project 596. The Lop Nur Desert is part of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which most of us know by its more famous name, East Turkestan. This site, by the way, is one of the most important locations where China conducts its nuclear tests to this day. The Uyghurs protested against the health threats resulting from these tests, especially since the Chinese at that time had not yet dug deep vertical shafts sufficient to reliably contain the deadly nuclear radiation, particularly for large bomb tests. And these protests are still ongoing from the Uyghurs despite the advancement of Chinese testing facilities. And that's natural because we're talking about nuclear tests, not experiments in a school lab, and this is an important piece of information to know in general. Importantly, for many years, China maintained a very low level of interest in expanding its nuclear arsenal throughout Mao's rule between 1949 and 1976, and afterwards until 2012, meaning for more than 60 years. To understand the extent of Chinese disinterest in the nuclear arsenal during this period, it is enough to know that, according to declared data, from the first Chinese nuclear explosion in the year 1964 until the end of the Cold War, China conducted 45 nuclear explosions compared to 210 by France in the same period and 715 by the Soviet Union. And how many for the United States? 1,030 explosions? This Chinese military doctrine indifferent to nuclear deterrence was erased as soon as Xi Jinping took over in 2012-2013. When the Chinese president first took office, one of the main things he focused on was the complete restructuring of the Chinese military and raising the defense spending budget to record levels. This is considered one of the most complex and extensive military restructuring and rebuilding operations in modern history. Of course, one of the most important weapons that Xi Jinping focused on was the missile force, which before the restructuring he carried out was called the 2nd Artillery Corps. After the restructuring, it became known as the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, and was transformed into an independent branch equivalent to the other three main forces, the land, naval, and air forces. Currently, we can consider without any exaggeration that the rocket force is the most important weapon in the Chinese army. We are talking about the largest ground missile forces in the world, with 45 missile brigades, 30 of which are capable of launching nuclear, ballistic, or cruise missiles. Each brigade operates between 6 to 12 mobile missile launchers. This force possesses more than 2,500 ballistic missiles of all types and sizes, with various warheads, both conventional and nuclear. Among them are 134 intercontinental missiles capable of carrying about 240 nuclear warheads, with a range reaching inside the United States. But the most important part of China's nuclear development is the launch silos it has built and is building. China currently has 350 missile launch platforms, some of which are under construction, including 135 platforms capable of launching these intercontinental missiles. Most of these platforms are located in the northern and central western regions of China, making them very difficult to target by any hostile forces. especially by the Americans, if they were to target them with conventional or nuclear cruise missiles. In addition to producing thousands of missiles and building hundreds of silos, China has invested in constructing regional missile storage facilities spread across the country, with the central fortified storage facility located in the Qinling Mountains in eastern China. In addition, the Chinese Missile Force is responsible for most of the defense procurements with the Equipment Administration, which makes it consume a significant portion of the Chinese military's annual budget, which is officially about $250 billion. It should be noted that most official government figures are often less than what is actually spent. That's why some estimates put the actual Chinese military budget at nearly $500 billion. To understand the extent of the development of the Chinese Missile Force currently, let me tell you that the force is training its soldiers to perform additional tasks beyond their primary missions. For example, training a driver of one of the mobile ballistic missile launch platforms on how to launch a missile in extreme emergency situations, and training one of the personnel of this launch platform who handle the missile or control systems to drive the platform itself, and so on. Why is this important? Because the ability to perform multiple tasks will make the entire force lethally effective, able to deliver strikes very quickly, and without human shortcomings for any reason. I'll give you a simple example. Look, my friends, regarding missile launch platforms, there's something called a survival protection procedure. This means that the team responsible for a mobile missile launch platform evacuates the site when they receive an alert that hostile forces have detected the platform's thermal signal and will strike it in a very short time. In late 2021, during one of the Chinese launch platform survival protection drills, the launch group responsible for one of the platforms was informed that the enemy would destroy their platform within 5 minutes. And that is a very, very short time to do anything other than evacuation. But instead of evacuating, the group's commander ordered the launch of the ballistic missile unexpectedly before the virtual enemy could destroy the platform. This means they will launch a ballistic missile in less than 5 minutes. This tells us that the Chinese missile force responsible for most of the nuclear ballistic arsenal is continuously developing to the point of launching missiles in record time instead of rapid evacuation. Besides, this tells us that the Chinese are currently training for scenarios dealing with preemptive strikes. For example, if a war breaks out in Taiwan and the American president at the time decides to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on China's nuclear capabilities, we will find that the Chinese are trying to significantly reduce the impact of that strike. In addition to that, they would precede that strike with one of their own. This increases the cost of any attack on China's nuclear capabilities and significantly tilts the deterrence balance in favor of China. If we look at submarines, we find that China currently has 6 nuclear ballistic submarines of the Type 094 and 2 of the Type 094A. These are improved versions of the original type, and all 8 are capable of carrying missiles with nuclear warheads of the JL-2 type. These submarines, each costing around $2 to $2.5 billion, are capable of targeting Alaska, the islands of Guam and Hawaii, Russia, and India from waters close to China. However, they cannot target the mainland United States unless the submarine sails into the depths of the Pacific Ocean, which increases the likelihood of it being targeted in various ways. Of course, in the context of the rapid modernization of Chinese nuclear capabilities, the Chinese have been building for about 5 years the more formidable version of the submarine, which is the Type 096, and it will cost about $4 billion per submarine. This model will be capable of carrying JL-3 ballistic missiles. What does this mean? It simply means that China, through this submarine which is nearing completion, will be able to strike the west coast and some northern parts of America from within Chinese territorial waters. However, it will still be unable to strike Washington unless it launches from the northeast of Japan. Of course, this will be a big leap for the Chinese nuclear arsenal and its ability to initiate an attack, not just deter. As for the bombers, China has developed a number of nuclear bombs that it can launch from its bases. Its bombers, especially the main bomber in the Chinese army, the 6 with its versions. However, modern military planning in recent years tends not to rely heavily on bombers due to their relative ease of being targeted, intercepted, or shot down compared to the other 2 legs of the nuclear triad, no matter how stealthy the bomber is. This leads us to a very recent Chinese trend in the last few years, which is the attempt to miniaturize nuclear warheads. Military experts, especially in America, say that what China wants most for its nuclear arsenal is this miniaturization. And if the Chinese develop new missiles that are more accurate in hitting any target, their scientists can reduce the power, size, and cost of the warheads. Reducing the size of nuclear warheads could make Chinese submarine missiles more destructive. It is currently believed that each Chinese missile carries about 3 warheads, compared to the American Trident II missile, for example, which can carry about 8 nuclear warheads. Reducing the size of the warhead could also enable China to develop hypersonic warheads, capable of bypassing American defenses. In March 2023, the commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, STRATCOM, General Anthony Cotton, expressed a similar view, saying that China is seeking to match and, in some areas, surpass the quantitative and qualitative nuclear parity with the United States. And he said that Chinese nuclear capabilities have long surpassed their declared policy, which has not officially changed, of minimum deterrence. And he added that China's capabilities continue to grow at an alarming rate. This statement is somewhat accurate. If we look at the map of Nuclear Web 2024, we will find that China is the second largest spender in the world after the United States, with an amount reaching $12.5 billion. I don't want to take up more of your time. In conclusion, I have a question for you. In your opinion, if China decided to annex Taiwan suddenly, and a war broke out between China and America, who do you think would defeat the other?